The world is quiet in a way that feels deliberate, as if sound itself has learned to be careful here. The Rocky Mountains rise under a pale sky, their ridgelines softened by distance and cold. Snow has not yet claimed everything, but it lingers in shaded pockets, stubborn and patient. The air carries a stillness that presses gently against the chest, making each breath feel noticed. This is a place where warmth is never assumed, and where survival begins with listening. Morning arrives slowly. Light spreads across the land without enthusiasm, touching the tops of the pines before slipping down their trunks. The trees stand tall and close together, their needles dark and dense, built to endure weight and wind. Nothing moves without purpose. Even the smallest bird seems aware that motion costs energy, and energy is precious. In this world, the seasons do not announce themselves with ceremony. They arrive when they are ready, and they stay as long as they please. Cold lives here year-round, not always as an enemy, sometimes as a quiet companion. It settles into the ground, seeps into stone, and waits. When the wind stirs, it carries the smell of sap and earth, sharp and clean. The mountains do not rush, they watch. They have watched glaciers come and go, forests burn and return, and now they watch small human shapes carve a life into their edges. The cabins appear almost by accident, tucked into clearings or leaning against slopes for shelter. From a distance they seem fragile, little more than shadows made of wood. Up close they are rough and deliberate, built with hands that learned quickly what mattered. The logs are thick, cut, and stacked with care, their ends notched to hold tight against one another. Every choice has been weighed against the cold. Every mistake would be remembered. Inside one of these cabins the air is dim and calm. Light filters through a small window covered with oiled paper, turning the outside world into a soft blur. The ceiling is low, close enough to feel protective. The floor is hard-packed earth, smoothed by boots and time. There is a quiet order to the space, a simple hearth, a rough table, a bed made of pine boughs and wool. Nothing is extra. Nothing is missing. Outside, the land stretches in all directions, vast and indifferent. Valleys open into forests that seem endless. Streams wind through rocks, their surfaces already edged with ice in the mornings. The mountains do not offer easy paths. They rise and fall without warning, their slopes testing legs and patience alike. To live here is to accept that effort is constant and rest is earned. Silence is not emptiness. It is full of small sounds that only reveal themselves when one is still. The faint creak of trees adjusting to temperature, the distant crack of ice forming along water's edge, the soft thud of snow slipping from a branch. These sounds are not comforting, but they are honest. They tell the truth about the world as it is. Winter is not yet complete, but it is already present. It waits in the lengthening shadows and the early frost that dusts the ground before dawn. It waits in the way the air sharpens without warning, biting exposed skin and reminding anyone outside to move with care. The mountains give signs, but they do not explain them. Understanding comes from attention, from years of watching the same hills and skies. For those who have chosen to remain, the mountains become teachers. They teach patience through long hours of labor. They teach humility through sudden storms. They teach restraint through scarcity. Here, confidence is quiet. Survival favors those who move steadily, who plan without panic, who respect the pace of the land. The days shorten almost imperceptibly at first. Afternoon light fades earlier than expected, slipping behind peaks and leaving the valleys cool and blue. Fires are lit sooner, their smoke rising straight into the still air. The scent of wood smoke drifts low and settles, a promise of warmth that must be maintained. A fire is never taken for granted. It is fed carefully, watched closely, allowed no moment of neglect. Night arrives with weight. The sky fills with stars, sharp and numerous, their light cold and distant. The moon paints the snow with a faint glow, turning the world silver and still. Inside the cabins the darkness is gentle, broken only by the soft pulse of embers. The walls hold back the wind, but they cannot block the awareness of what waits beyond them. In this place the cold is not dramatic. It does not rush or roar. It persists. It settles into bones and tools and thoughts. It asks questions slowly, testing resolve 1 hour at a time. Endurance is not measured in grand moments, but in small decisions repeated daily, to rise, to work, to conserve, to wait. The settlers who remain understand this rhythm. They have learned that the mountains do not need to be conquered. They need to be endured. Strength here is quiet, built from routine and attention. Each day is shaped around light and warmth, around the careful use of what has been gathered. Waste is a luxury that does not exist. As the land prepares itself for deeper cold, everything seems to pause. The forests hold their breath. The streams slow their song. Even the wind moves with restraint, as if acknowledging what is coming. There is a sense of being on the edge of something vast, something that will soon close in and test every wall, every fire, every ounce of patience. And yet within this stillness there is calm. A steady acceptance settles over the cabins and the people inside them. The world is as it is meant to be in this moment, cold, quiet, and waiting. The mountains stand, the cabins hold, and the night passes slowly, one measured breath at a time. The people who stayed were not the ones most expected to endure. They were not heroes in the way stories often demand, nor were they driven by glory or conquest. Most were ordinary men, and women were. Whose lives elsewhere had already taught them endurance in quieter ways. Some came from crowded eastern cities where factory whistles ruled the day and brick walls closed in the sky. Others had grown up on small farms, familiar with hard seasons and uncertain harvests. A few had already wandered for years, drawn westward by opportunity, solitude, or the simple need to start again. What they shared was not fearlessness, but a willingness to accept uncertainty. They arrived in the mountains knowing winter would come, knowing stories of cold that split stone and silence that stretched for weeks. Many passed through in warmer months, trading, trapping, moving on before the first real snows. But a smaller number paused, looked at the land, and chose to remain. It was a choice made quietly, often without witnesses, and always with consequences. Some stayed because they had invested too much to leave. Cabins built with aching hands, traps set along familiar streams, trails learned through repetition. Walking away meant abandoning months or years of labor. Others stayed because the mountains offered something they had not found elsewhere. Space, stillness, a sense that life here, though harsh, belonged entirely to them. In a world that often demanded conformity, the mountains asked only respect. There were trappers who followed the beaver runs until autumn closed the high passes. Traders who had learned the rhythms of indigenous trails and seasonal gatherings. Former soldiers who flew ND that the discipline of survival suited them better than the noise of war. Even a few families remained, their children learning early that play and work were not always separate things. Each carried a private reason, rarely spoken aloud. Staying through winter required a certain temperament. Those who thrived were often careful rather than bold. They planned quietly, worked steadily, and listened more than they spoke. Boasting had little value here. The mountains did not respond to confidence, they responded to preparation. Those who stayed learned to measure their strength honestly, to stop before exhaustion turned dangerous, to accept limits without resentment. Many had seen what happened to those who underestimated the cold. Stories circulated in low voices during late autumn meetings. A man found frozen beside an empty woodpile. A cabin discovered in spring, door drifted shut with snow, fire long dead. These were not told for drama but as reminders. Winter did not forgive optimism, yet fear alone did not send people away. Some left because they missed company, the sound of other voices, the reassurance of movement and trade. Others left because the work never seemed to end, because each task revealed 3 more waiting behind it. Leaving before winter was not cowardice, it was wisdom for many. The mountains would still be there next year. Those who stayed understood that winter would strip life down to essentials. Comfort would narrow to warmth, food and rest. Days would be shaped by light and fuel. Nights would be longer than seemed reasonable. The idea of enduring this did not excite them, but it steadied them. There was clarity in knowing exactly what mattered. Some had partners or small groups nearby, cabins spaced just far enough apart to allow privacy, close enough to offer help if needed. Others were alone, their nearest neighbour days away by foot in summer, unreachable once snow closed the passes. Solitude was not always chosen, but it was accepted. The land did not arrange itself for convenience. Many brought skills that quietly increased their chances. Knowledge of trapping and hunting, experience with woodworking, leather, metal, an understanding of food preservation learned from older generations. These skills were not romantic, they were practical. Knowing how to sharpen an axe properly, how to stack wood so it dried, how to mend clothing without waste could make the difference between endurance and despair. Age varied more than expected. Some were young, barely past their early 20s, carrying energy and optimism that had not yet been tested fully. Others were older, their bodies slower, but their judgment honed by years of mistakes already made elsewhere. In winter, experience often mattered more than strength. Knowing when not to act could be as important as knowing how. There were also those who stayed because they had nowhere else to go. Debts, failed ventures, or quiet shame had closed doors behind them. The mountain did not ask questions. They offered a place where a person could exist without explanation, where effort mattered more than history. Winter did not judge past choices, it responded only to present ones. As autumn deepened, those who remained became fewer, their movements more purposeful. Camps emptied, trails grew quiet. Those staying felt the shift not as loneliness at first, but as focus. Distractions fell away. The work became personal. Each log split, each strip of meat hung to dry, each seam sewn tighter carried meaning beyond itself. Choosing to stay was rarely spoken aloud as a decision. It revealed itself in action, in the way cabins were reinforced rather than abandoned, in the way supplies were counted and recounted, in the way glances lingered on the horizon a little longer, reading weather with growing seriousness. Staying was not a declaration, it was a commitment renewed daily. As the last travellers passed through and the first real cold settled in, those who remained felt a quiet boundary close around them. The world beyond the mountains faded, not suddenly, but gently, like a sound receding into distance. What remained was the land, the cabin, the work, and the long season ahead. And for those who dared to stay, that was long before the first heavy snow touched the ground. The mountains began to speak in quieter ways. Those who lived among them learned to listen, not with urgency, but with attention. An early winter rarely announced itself with drama. It revealed its intentions through patterns that repeated year after year, subtle enough to be missed by anyone in a hurry. For the settlers who stayed, reading these signs was not superstition. It was a skill learned through observation and consequence. The air was often the first to change. Not colder at first, just different. Mornings carried a sharper edge, a dryness that stung the lungs when drawn in too quickly. Even on sunny days, warmth felt thinner, less willing to linger on the skin. Shadows stretched longer in the afternoons, not only because of the shortening days, but because the sun itself seemed weaker, less committed to its task. Animals offered constant clues. Squirrels worked with greater urgency, their movements quick and focused as they gathered and buried food. Birds shifted their patterns, appearing in tighter groups before vanishing altogether, leaving the forests quieter than expected for the season. Larger animals began moving downslope earlier, seeking shelter and easier forage. Trappers paid close attention to fur, noticing when it grew thicker sooner than usual, a sign that cold was already pressing in. Insects disappeared more quickly. The small hum of late summer faded, leaving evenings unnaturally still. Streams ran clearer and colder, their surfaces tightening at the edges during the night. In the mornings, thin skins of ice formed in places that had stayed open the week before, melting by midday but returning again the next dawn. Each repeat carry, ed meaning plants too, revealed what was coming. Leaves turned and fell faster, dropping all at once rather than drifting down slowly over weeks. Berries shriveled on branches sooner than expected, their sweetness fading. Grass lost its colour early, flattening under frost instead of springing back. These were not dramatic changes, but they added up, one quiet signal layered over another. The sky told its own story. Clear days arrived with a brittle quality, the blue deeper and more distant. Clouds moved differently, lower and heavier, building without the towering shapes of summer storms. The wind shifted, settling into patterns that felt more deliberate, blowing from directions that carried cold from higher elevations. Settlers watched these changes with a practiced eye, noting not just what appeared, but how long it stayed. Sound behaved differently as well. On colder days, noises travelled farther, carried cleanly through dense air. A single axe strike echoed longer than it had weeks before. Footsteps sounded sharper, crunching on frost that had not been there the night before. Even voices seemed to carry differently, as if the air itself had tightened around them. Experienced settlers learned to trust combinations rather than single signs. One early frost meant little on its own. A sudden bird migration could be coincidence. But when frost, animal behaviour and shifting winds aligned, the message was clear. Winter was not approaching at its usual pace. It was moving fast. And time was shortening. These observations shaped daily decisions. A morning that felt wrong might mean postponing a hunt in favor of repairing a roof. An afternoon of unusual stillness could shift plans from traveling to cutting wood closer to home. Listening to the land allowed settlers to adjust before urgency turned into panic. Preparation was always easier when guided by warning rather than surprise. There was also an element of memory. Each person carried recollections of past winters, of moments when they had ignored signs and paid for it. A storm that arrived earlier than expected. A river that froze overnight, cutting off a route. These memories sharpened perception. The mountains had taught them once, and they did not forget. Talking about the signs happened rarely and quietly. There was no need for alarm. Those who understood simply worked harder, longer, with less hesitation. The urgency showed in their actions rather than their words. Woodpiles grew, repairs multiplied, food was checked and rechecked. The pace of days changed, tightening around essential tasks. Evenings became moments of reflection. As fires crackled and the light faded early, settlers replayed what they had seen that day. A flock of birds moving at dusk, a cold that settled earlier than expected. Each detail was weighed, not with fear, but with respect. The mountains were offering information, and ignoring it was a choice few were willing to make. There was a calm that came with this awareness. Knowing winter was coming early did not always bring dread. It brought clarity. Decisions became simpler. The world narrowed to what could be controlled and what could not. Effort was focused where it mattered most. As days passed and the signs continued to align, certainty replaced speculation. The mountains were closing in sooner than usual. Those who had learned to read this language adjusted without ceremony. They rose earlier, worked until light faded, and rested only when necessary. The land had spoken, and they had listened, shaping their lives around the truth it quietly revealed. When the first snow threatened, time seemed to contract. Days that once felt open and forgiving narrowed into measured blocks of light and labor. The mountains did not rush, but the people within them had no choice but to do so. Each morning began with a quick assessment of the sky, the air, the way the cold settled before sunrise. Snow did not need to fall heavily to change everything. Even the promise of it was enough to sharpen every decision. Work that might have been postponed earlier in the season now demanded immediate attention. Woodpiles were the first concern. A single stack no longer felt sufficient. Axes rang steadily through the forests as dead standing trees were chosen for their dryness and ease of splitting. Each log was counted not by number, but by days of warmth it might provide. The sound of chopping became a constant presence, echoing through valleys that would soon fall silent under snow. Cutting wood was only part of the race. Logs had to be hauled, split and stacked in ways that allowed air to circulate, ensuring they would burn efficiently once winter closed in. Settlers worked until their muscles trembled, stopping only long enough to drink cold water or wipe sweat from their eyes. Rest felt dangerous. Every pause was weighed against the risk of unfinished work. Food preparation intensified. Meat that had been taken earlier in the season was checked, trimmed and hung higher, protected from animals and moisture. Traps were reset closer to home, placed where they could be reached even after snow buried the trails. Berries were spread to dry fully, then packed away with care. Rations were planned with discipline, not optimism. There was no room for hoping supplies would stretch further than they truly could. Cabins became sites of constant adjustment. Gaps in chinking were repaired again and again as logs shifted with changing temperatures. Roofs were inspected from every angle, weak points reinforced with extra layers of bark or boughs. Doors were planed or padded to reduce drafts. Even small improvements felt significant, each one a small delay against the cold that was gathering strength. Tools were sharpened and repaired, not out of habit, but necessity. A dull axe wasted energy. A cracked handle could break at the wrong moment. Metal was cleaned and oiled to resist rust that moisture and cold would accelerate. Everything that be needed in winter was brought inside or hung close, where it could be reached without digging through snow. As the threat of snow grew closer, movement beyond the cabin shrank. Trips were shorter, routes chosen carefully. The thought of being caught away from shelter when the first real storm arrived lingered in the mind. Clouds were watched constantly, their shapes and speed noted. A sky that closed in quickly could mean a storm that lasted days. The pace of life shifted in subtle ways. Meals became simpler and quicker, eaten standing or by the fire. Sleep came harder, thoughts circling unfinished tasks. Even conversations, when they happened, were brief and focused. There was comfort in shared purpose even when people worked alone. Each knew the others were doing the same, racing the same invisible clock. The land itself seemed to change its posture. The ground grew harder underfoot. Puddles that once reflected the sky now held ice in the mornings. The smell of damp earth faded, replaced by something cleaner and sharper. Snow might not have fallen yet, but it was present in every breath, every tightening muscle. The first flakes, when they finally came, were often gentle. Light snow drifting down without urgency, settling on leaves and logs as if testing the ground. No one celebrated. These early flakes were warnings, not decorations. They melted by midday, leaving dampness behind, but their message was clear. The mountains were closing their doors. After that, every day felt borrowed. Settlers pushed themselves harder, aware that the next snowfall might not melt away. Hands cracked from cold and work, backs ached without relief. But stopping was not an option. The cost of exhaustion was known, but the cost of unpreparedness was greater. Evenings stretched longer as daylight faded earlier. Fires were lit sooner, their warmth felt more keenly than before. Outside, the world grew quieter, as if holding its breath. Inside, tools were leaned against walls, supplies stacked neatly, work lists shortened as tasks were completed one by one. When the first real snow arrived, thick and determined, it changed the sound of everything. Axes fell silent, footsteps softened. The landscape transformed overnight, covering effort and tracks alike. For those who had raced well, there was a moment of stillness, not relief, but recognition. The window for preparation had closed. They stepped inside their cabins as snow continued to fall, carrying with them the weight of the work just finished. The race had not been against the snow itself, but against time. Now winter had begun in earnest, and all that remained was to live with the choices made in those final hurried days. Fire was never simply warmth. It was time, safety, and the thin line between endurance and collapse. In the depths of a Rocky Mountain winter, fire became the most demanding presence in the cabin, always asking to be fed, never satisfied for long. Its hunger shaped days and nights alike, too, RNing life into a quiet cycle of gathering, burning, and guarding what little heat it gave back. Long before winter settled in, settlers understood that firewood was not a task to be finished, but a responsibility that would last until spring. Wood piles were built high and wide, yet still never felt enough. Each log represented hours of labor already spent and hours of survival yet to come. The math was simple and unforgiving. Too little wood meant cold nights, frozen water, and bodies that could not rest. Not all wood burned the same. Dead standing trees were prized, their cores dry and ready to catch quickly. Green wood smoked and wasted heat, coating chimneys and filling cabins with frustration. Settlers learned to read trees as carefully as they read weather, choosing species that burned hot and steady. Each cut was deliberate, conserving strength while maximizing return. Splitting wood was work that seemed to multiply on its own. A single tree became rounds, then split again into pieces small enough to fit the hearth. Larger logs were saved for the coldest nights, when the fire needed to last longer between tendings. Smaller pieces were kindling, essential for coaxing flame back from embers in the early mornings. Nothing was random. Each pile had a purpose. Once winter arrived, hauling wood became more difficult. Snow deepened, paths disappeared, and each trip outside demanded preparation. Wood was brought inside in careful amounts, stacked near the hearth to dry further, and remain within reach. Too much inside risked dampness and pests. Too little meant frequent trips into the cold. Balance had to be found and maintained. Fire dictated sleep. Nights were not continuous stretches of rest, but intervals measured by the fading of embers. Many settlers slept lightly, waking before the cold crept too far into the room, adding a log, adjusting airflow, listening for the change in sound as flame returned. These movements became automatic, performed half awake, guided by instinct sharpened through repetition. The hearth itself required constant attention. Ashes were cleared carefully to allow air to flow, but never completely removed. A bed of ash insulated coals, helping them survive longer. Chimneys were watched for build-up, their condition affecting how well smoke rose and heat stayed inside. A poorly drawing fire wasted precious fuel, its warmth slipping away into the night. Fire affected every other task. Water had to be heated to remain usable. Tools were warmed near the hearth to prevent cracking or stiffening. Clothing was dried carefully, turned often to avoid scorching. Even food depended on flame, from the slow simmer of stews to the careful warming of bread or dried meat. Without fire, the cabin quickly became unlivable. There was a mental weight to tending fire that settled quietly over time. Knowing that neglect, even for a few hours, could allow cold to gain ground created a constant awareness. Leaving the cabin meant planning around the fire's needs. Long trips were avoided. Time away was measured carefully. The fire was both anchor and constraint. On the coldest days, fire seemed to struggle despite every effort. Flames burned lower, consumed wood faster, and offered less warmth in return. The cold pressed in from all sides, testing the limits of walls and will. On those days, settlers sat closer to the hearth, movements slower, conserving energy as much as fuel. Yet there was also comfort in fire's presence. Its steady crackle filled the silence, offering sound when the world outside was muted by snow. Light from the flames softened rough walls and familiar tools, turning the cabin into a contained world. Watching embers glow became a form of rest, a reminder that warmth, however fragile, was still being held. Children, when present, learned early to respect fire. They understood its dangers and its necessity. Adults moved around it with practiced ease, aware of how easily it could turn from ally to threat. Sparks were watched, hearths kept clear. In winter, a cabin fire was never left to chance. As weeks passed, woodpiles shrank steadily. Each reduction was noted, each remaining stack counted and recounted. Anxiety grew quietly, not as panic, but as vigilance. Settlers adjusted burn patterns, letting fires die lower during the day, when movement and work kept bodies warmer, saving fuel for night. Fire taught patience and discipline. It rewarded care and punished waste. It demanded attention but offered survival in return. Through long months of cold, the relationship between settler and flame became intimate and unspoken. In the end, winter was endured one log at a time, each flame a small victory against a cold that never stopped trying to take everything. The cabins were never meant to impress. They were not built for comfort in the way later homes would be, nor for beauty beyond what usefulness allowed. Each one rose from the ground as a response to necessity, shaped by the understanding that winter would test every weakness. In the Rocky Mountains, a cabin was not a shelter in the gentle sense of the word. It was a barrier, a line drawn between the living and a cold that would take any invitation it was given. The first decision was always location. A cabin placed carelessly could doom its builder before the first snowfall. Too close to a valley floor, and cold air would settle and linger. Too high on an exposed ridge, and wind would never rest. The safest spots were often tucked into the edge of a slope, where trees broke the wind and the land itself offered some protection. Proximity to water mattered, but not too close. Streams froze and flooded in turns, and snowmelt could rot a poorly placed foundation. Once the site was chosen, the work began with trees. Not all wood was equal. Settlers learned quickly which species held warmth better, which resisted rot, which split cleanly under an axe. Logs were cut thick and heavy, not for strength alone, but for mass. Thick walls slowed the passage of cold, holding heat inside longer once a fire was lit. Each log was dragged, lifted, and set by hand, a process that demanded patience more than speed. The walls rose low. Ceilings were kept close, forcing heat to remain near the flue. Where people lived and slept. Space was not a luxury that made sense here. A smaller room warmed faster and required less fuel to maintain. Every inch added meant more wood burned, more effort spent, more risk taken. Cabins felt tight not by accident, but by design. Windows were few and small, glass was rare and fragile, so oiled paper or thin hides were stretched over openings instead. Light entered softly, diffused and dim, but that was acceptable. Large windows lost heat quickly and offered no protection against wind. Darkness was easier to endure than cold. Many cabins had only a single window, placed to catch morning light without inviting storms. The door was often the weakest point, and builders knew it. It was cut low and narrow, forcing anyone entering to bow slightly, reducing the rush of cold air inside. Hinges were simple, often leather or wood, and gaps were inevitable. Settlers compensated with heavy blankets or hides hung inside, creating a second barrier against drafts. In winter, doors were opened as little as possible, treated with the same care as fire. The spaces between logs were packed with chinking, a mixture of mud, moss, grass, and sometimes animal hair. This work was slow and unglamorous, done kneeling in the dirt, hands numbed by cold water and earth. But it was essential. Even a small gap could pull heat from a cabin night after night, undoing hours of labor at the woodpile. Chinking had to be checked and repaired constantly as logs shifted and ride. The roof demanded special attention. Snow was heavy, and a poorly built roof could collapse under its weight. Layers of bark, poles, and pine boughs were arranged to shed snow and resist moisture. A slight slope allowed snow to slide away instead of piling up. Leaks were not minor inconveniences, they were threats. Moisture inside a cabin meant damp clothing, rotting wood, and cold that crept deeper with each passing day. Inside, the hearth was the heart of everything. It was positioned carefully, often against a wall or in a corner, built from stone or clay if available. Fireplaces were designed to draw smoke upward efficiently, conserving heat rather than letting it escape. A poorly drawing hearth could fill a cabin with smoke, forcing the door open and wasting warmth. Learning how to build and tend a fire properly was as important as learning how to hunt. Floors were usually bare earth or rough planks. Rugs were rare, but hides were sometimes laid down where people slept or sat. Insulation came from layers rather than materials. Clothing, blankets, stored goods, all added to the sense of enclosure. Nothing was left unused. Even walls became storage, with tools hung neatly to keep them dry and close at hand. Cabins were oriented with intention. The door often faced away from prevailing winter winds. Nearby trees were left standing to break gusts, even if clearing them might have made movement easier. Settlers learned to work with the land rather than against it. Cutty. Every tree invited the wind to move freely, and wind was cold's most dangerous ally. These structures aged quickly. Logs shrank, chinking cracked, roofs sagged. A cabin was never finished. It demanded constant attention, constant small repairs. Neglect showed immediately, often in the form of drafts that whispered through the walls at night. Listening for those whispers became a habit. A change in sound could mean a new gap, a problem that needed solving before nightfall. Despite their roughness, cabins offered something invaluable, a controlled environment in an uncontrollable world. Inside, time slowed. Movements became deliberate. Outside, storms could rage. Temperatures could fall beyond imagination, but within those thick walls, a fire could be kept alive, a body could rest, and a mind could remain steady. To step inside one of these cabins after a day in the cold was to cross an invisible threshold. The air changed, sounds softened, the world narrowed to a manageable size. These were not homes in the sentimental sense, but they were sanctuaries built from understanding and effort. Each log, each patch of mud, each careful choice was an act of defiance against a winter that intended to claim everything it could. Food in winter was not about comfort or choice. It was about continuity, about ensuring that each day could be met with enough strength to reach the next. Long before snow sealed the land, settlers had already begun to think of meals in terms of months rather than hours. Every bite taken during winter was connected to decisions made in warmer seasons, and those connections were never forgotten. Preparation began early, often before summer had fully matured. Meat taken from hunts was treated with care, cut and cleaned with the understanding that nothing would be wasted. Drying racks stood near cabins. Strips of meat hung where air could move freely around them. Smoke from slow fires added protection, discouraging insects and preserving flavor. These methods were simple, learned through repetition rather than instruction, and relied on patience more than tools. Salt, when available, was precious. It was traded for with caution, measured carefully and used sparingly. Salted meat lasted longer, resisted spoilage, and offered reassurance during the darkest months. Without it, drying and smoking had to be done perfectly. A single mistake could ruin weeks of effort. Settlers learned to recognize the signs of trouble early, discarding questionable pieces without hesitation, no matter how much labor they represented. Plant foods were gathered with equal care. Berries were picked at their peak, spread thin to dry, then stored in cloth or leather bags that allowed them to breathe. Roots were dug and stored in cool, dark spaces where they would not freeze. Grains, when available, were kept dry and guarded closely. Each type of food had its own requirements, its own vulnerabilities. Once winter arrived, rations were set. This was often the hardest adjustment. Hunger did not wait politely for spring, and cold increased the body's demands. Still, restraint was essential. Eating too much early could mean starvation later. Meals became smaller and simpler, planned not around desire but around endurance. A piece of dried meat, a handful of berries, a warm broth stretched thin. These were not meant to satisfy, only to sustain. Cooking changed as well. Firewood was too valuable to waste on elaborate meals. Food was often prepared in single pots, simmered slowly to draw out as much nourishment as possible. Bones were reused, boiled again and again to extract every bit of strength they held. Nothing edible was thrown away. Even scraps were saved, added back into the cycle when needed. Hunting did not stop entirely in winter, but it became unpredictable. Snow made tracking easier in some ways, revealing movement clearly, but deep drifts and cold increased risk. A failed hunt cost energy and time, both in short supply. Traps were checked when possible, but reliance on stored food remained essential. Winter hunting was a supplement, never a plan. Animals sensed scarcity too. Rodents and predators were drawn to cabins by stored food, testing barriers and patience. Settlers guarded their supplies carefully, hanging bags from rafters, storing items in sealed containers when possible. A single breach could cost days or weeks of sustenance. Vigilance extended even into sleep, ears tuned to unfamiliar sounds. Psychologically, food carried weight beyond nutrition. Knowing supplies were limited shaped behavior and thought. Each meal was eaten slowly, appreciated for what it provided rather than what it lacked. Sharing, when it happened, was deliberate and meaningful. To offer food in winter was to offer time, warmth, and survival itself. Children learned these lessons quickly. They understood that asking for more was not always possible, that fullness was not the goal. Adults modeled restraint, often eating less themselves to ensure others had enough. These decisions were made quietly, without ceremony, woven into the fabric of daily life. As winter stretched on, supplies dwindled at a steady, watched pace. The midpoint of winter brought a particular tension when spring still felt distant but stores were no longer abundant. Settlers adjusted again, reducing portions slightly, increasing reliance on broth and water. Hunger became a familiar companion, present but managed. Despite the discipline, there was also hope embedded in stored food. Each remaining sack, each hanging strip of meat represented foresight and effort. They were tangible proof that survival had been planned for, not left to chance. Eating from these stores was a daily reminder that the past season's work continued to matter. When spring finally approached, the last of the winter food was often consumed with mixed feelings: relief that it had been enough, pride in having endured, and a renewed respect for the careful balance that had ride them through months of cold. Food had not been plentiful, but it had been sufficient, and in that sufficiency lay survival. The work of sealing a cabin was quiet and easily overlooked, yet it stood between comfort and catastrophe. Chinking the gaps between logs was never dramatic labour. It did not ring through the forest like an axe or glow like a hearth. Still, it demanded patience, repetition, and an understanding that even the smallest opening could invite winter inside. Logs were never perfect. No matter how carefully they were cut and stacked, gaps formed as wood dried and shifted. Temperature changes widened these spaces, turning hairline cracks into channels for wind. Settlers learned quickly that a cabin was a living structure, always moving, always changing. Chinking was not a task to complete once, but a process that continued throughout the season. The materials were gathered nearby. Mud from creek banks, mixed with grass, moss, and sometimes animal hair, created a substance that could be pressed into gaps and shaped by hand. The mixture had to be just right. Too wet, and it would slump and fall away. Too dry, and it would crack as soon as it set. Learning this balance came through trial and error, guided by feel rather than measurement. Applying chinking was slow work. Settlers knelt close to the walls, hands numb from cold earth and water. Each gap was packed carefully, pressed deep to block airflow, then smoothed to shed moisture. Larger spaces required backing with thin strips of wood before filling, adding another layer of protection. The goal was not appearance, but endurance. Wind revealed weaknesses mercilessly. A draft that slipped through unnoticed during calm weather could become a constant pull during storms, stealing warmth hour by hour. Settlers listened for these drafts at night, when the cabin was quiet and the fire burned low. A faint whistle or sudden chill against the skin meant work waiting at first light. Chinking also protected against moisture. Snow that melted during brief thaws could seep into walls, freezing again overnight. This cycle cracked wood and loosened seals, creating new openings. By keeping gaps filled, settlers reduced the movement of water and the damage it caused. Dry walls were warmer walls, and dryness became a priority equal to heat. Inside the cabin, chinking changed the feel of the space. Once sealed, the air grew calmer, less restless. Heat lingered longer after the fire died down. Smoke drew more cleanly upward, no longer pulled sideways by drafts. These improvements were subtle but unmistakable, reinforcing the value of the effort spent. Chinking required maintenance. As winter progressed, settlers checked walls repeatedly, running hands along seams, pressing where material had shrunk or fallen away. Repairs were made even during cold spells, quickly and carefully, knowing that delay would cost more warmth later. Tools for chinking were simple, often nothing more than a stick or flat. Stone, but skill mattered more than equipment. The work also demanded humility. No matter how well a cabin was built, it would never be completely sealed. Perfection was not the goal. Reducing exposure was enough. Settlers accepted that some cold would always find its way inside. Their task was to limit its reach, not to eliminate it entirely. There was a rhythm to this maintenance that fit winter life. On days when storms kept people close to home, chinking offered productive work that did not require leaving shelter for long. It kept hands busy and minds focused, reinforcing a sense of control. Even small repairs felt like acts of resistance. Children, when present, were often given simple chinking tasks, learning early how walls worked and why care mattered. These lessons were practical and immediate. Feeling a draft disappear under a pressed handful of mud made the purpose clear without explanation. As temperatures dropped further, chinking grew harder. Materials froze, hands stiffened, and repairs took longer. Settlers adapted, warming mud near the fire, working in short intervals to avoid frostbitten fingers. Persistence mattered more than speed. Each sealed crack was a small victory. In the depth of winter, when cold pressed hardest, well-chinked walls revealed their worth, fires burned more efficiently, nights were more bearable, energy was conserved rather than wasted. The cabin held together not just physically, but as a space where survival felt possible. Chinking was never celebrated. It left no dramatic evidence of effort, no visible achievement to admire. Yet it was among the most important work done before and during winter. Between each log, in every packed seam, lay the difference between holding warmth and surrendering it. In those narrow spaces, life and death negotiated quietly, and careful hands tipped the balance towards survival. Cold announced itself gently at first, as a sensation easy to dismiss, a stiffness in the fingers that lingered longer than expected, a tightness in the jaw when speaking outside. These early signs were familiar, almost routine, and rarely caused concern. But as winter deepened, cold changed its nature. It stopped being a background condition and became something that pressed directly against the body, making itself known with every movement and breath, breathing itself transformed. Air drawn into the lungs felt sharp and dry, as if it scraped along the inside of the chest. Each inhale required intention, especially in the early morning when temperatures were lowest. Speaking outdoors became brief and economical. Long conversations wasted heat and irritated the throat. Many learned to breathe through cloth or scarves, softening the air before it entered the body. Hands suffered early and often. Fingers lost their flexibility, becoming slow and clumsy even during simple tasks. Leather stiffened. Metal tools pulled warmth instantly from bare skin, forcing settlers to work carefully and deliberately. Gloves were worn whenever possible, but even then, dexterity was limited. Tasks that once took minutes stretched into long, careful efforts. Feet followed closely behind. Boots insulated against snow but not against the relentless cold that crept upward from frozen ground. Standing still for too long invited numbness, a dull warning that movement was required. Walking became a balance between conserving energy and maintaining circulation. Inside the cabin, feet were kept close to the fire, rotated slowly to avoid overheating one side while the other remained cold. The face bore constant exposure. Wind burned cheeks and lips, leaving skin tight and cracked. Eyes watered easily, lashes collecting frost that had to be brushed away gently. Even blinking became noticeable, each movement reminding the body of the environment it inhabited. Settlers learned to keep their heads lowered, collars raised, movements efficient. Cold also altered posture. Bodies hunched instinctively, shoulders drawn inward to protect the chest. Over time, this created deep aches along the spine and neck. Stretching helped briefly, but relief was temporary. The cold demanded space within the body, compressing muscles and joints until discomfort became a constant companion. Sleep offered little escape. Even near the hearth, warmth faded quickly once fires died down. Settlers slept layered in clothing and blankets, shifting positions throughout the night to restore circulation. Waking moments were frequent, of 10, prompted by a creeping chill rather than sound or light. Rest came in fragments, accumulated slowly. Pain from cold was not sudden or dramatic. It settled gradually, a steady pressure that wore down resistance. Muscles tired faster, hands shook more easily. Small movements required effort. This fatigue was not weakness, it was the body responding honestly to its conditions. Those who understood this learned to pace themselves, resting before exhaustion deepened into something more dangerous. Cold also affected the mind through the body. Discomfort narrowed focus, making it harder to think beyond immediate needs. Long-term planning became difficult on the coldest days. Settlers adjusted by relying on routines established earlier in the season. Habit replaced deliberation when thinking felt heavy. Even simple acts like washing became calculated decisions. Water had to be warmed carefully and exposure minimized. Wet skin lost heat rapidly, turning necessity into risk. Cleanliness remained important, but it was balanced against the body's limits. Everything was weighed against warmth. The cold had a way of revealing vulnerability without judgment. It did not single out the weak or unprepared. It affected everyone equally, pressing into joints already worn by labor, into scars from earlier injuries, into bones that remembered other winters. Age became noticeable in new ways. Experience offered strategies, but the body still felt every degree. Yet within this pain there was adaptation. Over time, settlers learned what sensations required immediate response and which could be endured. They recognized the difference between discomfort and danger. This knowledge was not written or taught formally. It was learned through attention, through listening to the body as carefully as they listened to the land. Inside the cabin, small comforts mattered more than before. A warm stone near the bed, a cup held close to the chest, the steady glow of embers offering reassurance, even when heat was limited. These moments did not erase pain, but they softened it, making it manageable. Cold demanded respect, not fear. Those who panicked wasted energy. Those who ignored it suffered needlessly. The most resilient learned to acknowledge pain without letting it dominate their actions. They worked within their limits, stopped when necessary, and accepted discomfort as part of the season's cost. As winter progressed, the body adjusted, becoming less surprised by cold but never immune to it. Pain became familiar, predictable, woven into daily life. It no longer startled, but it always instructed. Through it, settlers learned when to act, when to rest, and when to wait. In the Rocky Mountain winters, cold was never abstract. It was felt in hands, lungs, joints, and thoughts. It reminded settlers of their physical presence in the world, of the fragile warmth they carried with them. Enduring it required more than strength. It required awareness, patience, and a steady acceptance of the body's honest responses to an unforgiving season. Isolation did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded slowly, almost politely, as autumn movement faded and winter settled in. At first the quiet felt welcome, a relief from constant effort and decision. But as days passed and the land closed in under snow, The silence deepened, pressing inward until it became something that could be felt rather than merely noticed. The absence of sound was the first change. Trails that once carried voices, footsteps, and animal movement fell silent. Wind still moved through the trees, but even that seemed muted, softened by snow. Inside the cabin, every small noise stood out. The crackle of fire, the scrape of a chair, the rhythm of breathing. These sounds filled the space, becoming companions in a world where few others remained. Days stretched in unfamiliar ways. Without regular interaction or change, time lost some of its shape. Morning and evening blended into one another, marked mainly by light and fire. Tasks provided structure, but once they were done, hours could feel long and unanchored. The mind wandered more easily in these moments, circling thoughts without resolution. Conversation, when it occurred, was often one-sided. People spoke aloud to themselves, to animals, to the fire. At first it felt unnecessary, even strange. Over time it became comforting. Sound confirmed presence. Hearing a voice, even one's own, pushed back against the emptiness. Those who resisted this habit sometimes felt the silence more sharply. Memories grew louder in isolation. Past lives returned with unexpected clarity. Faces, places, and moments resurfaced without invitation. The mind reached backward when forward movement was limited. These recollections were not always pleasant, but they filled space that might otherwise feel hollow. Remembering became a way of staying connected to something beyond the cabin walls. Isolation also sharpened emotions. Small frustrations felt larger. Minor setbacks lingered longer. Without distraction, thoughts had room to expand. Settlers learned to manage this by maintaining routines, repeating tasks even when they seemed unnecessary. Order within the cabin mirrored order within the mind. Light played a crucial role. Short winter days reduced exposure to the sun, deepening the sense of enclosure. Darkness arrived early and stayed late, wrapping the cabin in a quiet that could feel heavy. Fires and lamps softened the edges, but could not fully replace daylight. Many settlers gravitated toward windows during the few bright hours, standing still, absorbing what light was available. The lack of news from the outside world added to the weight. Once winter closed the passes, information stopped flowing. There were no updates, no reassurance that others were well or that circumstances had changed. Life became intensely local. The world narrowed to what could be seen from the cabin door and remembered from the past. Loneliness was not always sadness. Often it was simply awareness. Awareness of being one person in a vast landscape, aware that help was distant and unlikely. This knowledge sat quietly in the background, influencing decisions and emotions without demanding attention. It was a constant, like cold accepted rather than resisted. Some settlers found relief in observation, watching the way snow accumulated, how light shifted across the same view day after day. These details offered a sense of continuity. The world was still moving, still changing, even if slowly. Paying attention grounded the mind, anchoring it in the present moment. Physical work helped manage isolation. Even repetitive tasks gave the body purpose and the mind direction. Hands busy left less room for anxious thought. When storms prevented outdoor work, indoor tasks took on greater importance. Tools were cleaned repeatedly, supplies reorganized. These actions were less about necessity and more about maintaining balance. Sleep patterns shifted under isolation's influence. Some slept more, retreating into rest as a way to pass time. Others slept less, thoughts circling late into the night. Both responses were common and accepted. There was no standard way to experience winter solitude, only ways to adapt to it. Occasional encounters, when they happened, felt intense. A brief visit from a neighbour, a shared meal, or even distant voices carried more weight than usual. Words were chosen carefully. Silences were shared without discomfort. These moments reminded settlers of their humanity without overwhelming them. Over time, many developed a quiet resilience. The mind adjusted, finding steadiness within limited space. Isolation became less of an intrusion and more of a condition, like weather. It could be acknowledged without being fought. The mountains offered no remedy for isolation, only context. They made it clear that being alone was not a failing but a circumstance. Those who endured learned to hold their thoughts gently, to let silence exist without filling it urgently. In doing so, they discovered that the mind, like the body, could adapt to winter's pressure, finding calm even as the world remained still. Storms did not arrive with warning bells or clear beginnings. They gathered quietly, often during moments that seemed ordinary, when the sky was already pale and the air already cold. A subtle thickening of clouds, a change in the way light reflected off snow, and the world began to narrow. Those who lived through Rocky Mountain winters learned to recognize this shift and to move inward, both physically and mentally. At first, snow fell gently, almost without sound. Flakes drifted straight down, settling into existing drifts, softening edges and erasing tracks. This early stage felt manageable, even peaceful. Visibility shortened, but familiar landmarks still appeared through the falling white. Work outside might continue briefly, but attention stayed on the sky, on how quickly conditions were changing. As the storm deepened, snow thickened and wind joined in, lifting flakes into the air and driving them sideways. Shapes disappeared. Trees blurred into pale forms, then vanished entirely. Distances that once felt small expanded into uncertainty. A cabin a short walk away could become unreachable in minutes. Sound dulled, swallowed by the snow, leaving an unsettling quiet that made direction hard to judge. Inside the cabin, the storm announced itself through pressure and movement. Wind pressed against walls, testing every joint and seam. Snow piled against doors and windows, dimming light until midday resembled dusk. The cabin creaked and shifted, responding to forces it was never meant to resist indefinitely. These sounds were not alarming at first, but they demanded attention. During heavy storms, time lost its usual markers. Without clear light or sound, hours blended together. Day and night became difficult to distinguish. Fires burned continuously, their maintenance becoming the primary task. Sleep came in intervals, broken by the need to tend the hearth or listen for changes in the storm's tone. Outside, the world was transformed. Familiar paths vanished under deep drifts. Landmarks were buried or altered beyond recognition. Even the ground itself seemed to move, reshaped by wind and accumulation. Storms did not just cover the land, they rearranged it. When they passed, the world that emerged was often unfamiliar, requiring relearning. Venturing out during a storm was avoided whenever possible. The risk of disorientation was high, even near the cabin. Snow-stung exposed skin, driven by wind that stole breath and balance. Settlers stayed inside not out of fear, but out of respect for conditions that could overwhelm without effort. Isolation intensified during storms. Any sense of connection to others faded completely. The cabin became the entire world, bounded by walls and reinforced by necessity. Communication. Beyond this space was impossible. The mind had to accept this temporary narrowing, finding stability within it. Listening became a constant practice. Changes in wind direction or intensity signaled shifts in the storm. A sudden quiet could mean snowfall was lightening, or that wind had temporarily paused. These details mattered, offering clues about what might come next. Knowledge of storms was built through experience, through nights spent awake, listening. Snow accumulation demanded attention even during the storm. When safe, settlers cleared areas around doors and vents, preventing snow from sealing the cabin completely. This work was done quickly and carefully, exposure minimized. Returning inside brought relief, but also renewed awareness of the storm's strength. When storms lasted multiple days, supplies were tested. Wood was consumed faster, food preparation slowed, and routines tightened further. Settlers adjusted without panic, drawing on preparation and patience. Storms were not unexpected, they were endured. As storms finally began to fade, they often did so gradually. Snow lightened, wind softened, and faint outlines of trees reappeared. The return of visibility felt tentative, as if the world were cautiously revealing itself again. Settlers waited before venturing far, allowing conditions to stabilize. Stepping outside after a storm was a careful act. The air felt different, heavy and still. Snow lay deep and undisturbed, reflecting light so brightly it strained the eyes. Silence returned, deeper than before. The world felt newly made, stripped of recent history. Storms left marks that lasted long after they passed. Drifts hardened into barriers. Roofs carried extra weight. Trails required cutting again. The effort of recovery became part of winter life, accepted as necessary. These storms did more than challenge survival. They altered perception. By erasing familiar reference points, they reminded settlers of the land's power and indifference. Each storm reduced the world to essentials, then slowly gave it back, reshaped. In the Rocky Mountains, winter storms were not events to conquer or overcome. They were forces to wait out, to endure within strong walls and steady routines. When they erased the world, those who survived learned to hold still, trusting that in time the landscape would return, changed but still offering a place to stand. Night in the mountains did not begin at sunset. It began when the fire became the center of everything. As darkness pressed against the cabin walls and the cold deepened outside, time was no longer counted in hours, but in embers. Each glow, each fade, marked another passage through the long winter night. The fire was never allowed to go out. During the day it could be modest, allowed to rest while light and movement filled the hours. At night it became essential. The hearth was fed carefully, logs chosen for how long they would burn rather than how brightly. Settlers learned to read wood the way others read clocks, knowing which pieces would last and which would collapse into ash too quickly. As night settled in, the cabin grew quieter. Tasks slowed, then stopped. Tools were set aside, food put away. What remained was listening. The crackle of the fire, the occasional shift of timber as the cabin responded to cold, the distant wind moving across snow. These sounds formed a rhythm that guided the body toward rest, even when the mind resisted sleep. Sleep itself came lightly. It arrived in short stretches, interrupted by instinct or necessity. Someone would wake before the fire faded too far, rising slowly from blankets stiff with cold air. The movement was practiced, deliberate. Adding wood too quickly could send sparks flying, too slowly, and the room would cool beyond comfort. Balance mattered, even half asleep. The glow of embers offered just enough light. Shadows stretched across rough walls, moving gently as the fire breathed. Faces, when visible, appeared softer in this dimness, less defined. The world beyond the hearth dissolved, leaving only warmth and motion. In these moments the cabin felt smaller but safer, a pocket of life held together by flame. Outside, night erased depth and distance. The windows showed nothing but darkness, sometimes broken by snow reflecting faint starlight. The land beyond the cabin might as well not exist. Mountains, forests, trails, all vanished into black. The fire became the only proof that the world still had edges. Nights were when cold pressed hardest. Temperatures dropped sharply, sinking into levels that crept through cracks and seams despite careful construction. Breath fogged the air inside the cabin. Blankets were layered, clothing worn even while sleeping. The fire's warmth reached only so far, creating a small island of comfort surrounded by chill. Listening to the fire was a skill. Its sound changed as fuel shifted and burned. A steady crackle meant balance. A hollow hiss warned of damp wood. Sudden pops sent sparks upward, reminding settlers to stay alert. These sounds became familiar, almost comforting, a language understood without thought. The mind wandered more freely at night. Without daylight tasks, thoughts moved inward. Some nights were peaceful, filled with simple awareness of warmth and safety. Others carried restlessness. Memories surfaced uninvited. Questions lingered without answers. The fire witnessed all of it, steady and impartial. Embers held particular meaning. When flames died down and only glowing coals remained, the night felt most fragile. This was the threshold between warmth and cold, between continuity and danger. Letting embers fade too far risked losing the fire entirely. Reviving them required patience and skill, coaxing heat back into flame with careful placement and breath. Many settlers developed rituals around this moment. A final log placed just before sleep, a mental note of how long it should last, trust in the fire, but never complete reliance. One ear always stayed tuned, even in dreams, ready to wake at the slightest change. Time stretched during these hours. Without clocks, night felt endless. The fire marked progress, each tending another small victory against the cold. Dawn was anticipated not by light, but by the fire's endurance. If embers still glowed when morning approached, the night had been managed well. Children learned early to respect nighttime routines. They were taught not to disturb the fire unnecessarily, not to waste warmth. Even in play, voices stayed low. Night demanded calm. Excitement belonged to daylight, when movement and noise did not carry such weight. Loneliness often surfaced at night. With no distractions, the absence of others felt sharper. Some settlers spoke softly into the dark, not expecting answers. Others held on to objects that carried memory. The fire listened without judgment, offering its steady presence as response. Storm nights were different. Wind roared, snow struck walls, and the fire burned harder in response. These nights required more frequent tending. Sleep came in fragments. Yet the fire also felt stronger, more alive, as if aware of its role. It fought the storm in its own way, holding warmth against chaos. As winter deepened, nights grew longer. Fires consumed more wood. Embers were watched more closely. The rhythm of waking, feeding, and resting became second nature. Night was no longer something to endure reluctantly, but a condition understood and managed. When morning finally arrived, it often did so quietly. Light crept in through frosted windows, pale and hesitant. The fire still glowed, reduced but alive. Embers marked the successful passage of another night. They were proof of attention, patience, and care. In the Rocky Mountain winters of the 1800s, survival did not hinge on dramatic moments alone. It rested in these nights, measured not by hours, but by embers. Each glow that lasted until dawn was a small triumph, a reminder that warmth could be carried through darkness, one careful tending at a time. Illness in the mountains did not arrive loudly. It crept in quietly, often mistaken at first for simple fatigue or the normal ache of hard living. A cough lingered longer than expected. A joint refused to loosen with warmth. A small cut stayed red instead of closing. In a place where every day demanded strength, weakness was easy to overlook until it could no longer be ignored. There was no doctor riding up the trail, no medicine chest beyond what had been carried or traded months before. Help, if it existed at all, was far away and unreachable once winter closed the passes. Settlers understood this deeply. From the moment the first snow settled, they knew that whatever happened inside the cabin would have to be faced alone. Injuries were part of daily life. Axes slipped, knives glanced, splinters buried themselves deep in fingers already numb from cold. Most wounds were treated simply. Snow cleaned blood when water froze. Cloth was torn into strips. Grease or resin might be pressed into a cut in hopes of sealing it. Healing was slow and infection was a constant fear, even if it was not fully understood. Illness was more frightening than injury. A broken bone could be splintered, a deep cut could be bound, but fever brought uncertainty. Chills came even while sitting close to the fire. Skin burned while breath fogged the air. Strength faded, and with it the ability to tend the fire, fetch water, or cut wood. In winter, weakness threatened survival more than pain ever could. When sickness took hold, routines changed. Tasks were reduced to essentials. Movements became deliberate and economical. The fire was kept closer, built smaller but steadier, so it could be tended with less effort. Food was rationed carefully, even if appetite vanished. Eating became an act of discipline rather than desire. Cabins grew quieter during illness. Tools lay untouched. Outside sounds faded as attention turned inward. Time slowed, marked not by work or daylight, but by breaths and heartbeats. Sleep came in uneven stretches, broken by coughing or discomfort. Dreams blurred with waking, and memory lost its sharp edges. Some settlers relied on remedies learned from others who had passed through the mountains before them. Teas brewed from dried plants gathered in summer, poultices pressed against swollen skin, steam inhaled from kettles warmed carefully over the fire. These treatments offered comfort more than cure, but comfort mattered. It gave the body a chance to hold on. Pain was endured quietly. Complaining wasted energy. Tears froze quickly anyway. Many settlers believed that acknowledging pain too openly invited it to grow. Instead, they focused on small tasks they could still manage, adding a log to the fire, shifting position to ease pressure, taking slow sips of water melted from snow. Isolation made illness heavier. There was no one to watch for changes, no shared burden. A man sick alone had only his own judgment to rely on, and judgment blurred with fever. Decisions became difficult. Was it better to rest or move, to eat now or later, to save strength or spend it on preparation for what might come next? In cabins shared by more than one person, illness carried its own dangers. Care had to be given without spreading sickness. Warmth and closeness helped healing but risked passing weakness along. Choices were made carefully. One person might take over fire duty while another rested. Food was divided differently. Silence became a form of respect. Injury during winter was especially dangerous. A broken leg meant no wood gathering. A deep cut meant slower movement, less heat, fewer calories burned safely. Even minor injuries could cascade into larger problems. Settlers learned to move cautiously, even when urgency pressed. One mistake could mean weeks of suffering. The cold complicated everything. Swelling stiffened joints, bandages froze, blood thickened and moved sluggishly. Fingers lost feeling, making treatment clumsy. Simple tasks like tying cloth or opening a container required concentration and patience. The body fought not only sickness or injury, but the environment itself. Fear was an unspoken companion. Not fear of death exactly, but fear of fading quietly, unnoticed. Settlers knew stories of men found in spring, cabins intact, supplies nearby, yet lifeless. Illness had taken them while winter sealed the world outside. These stories lingered in the mind, especially during long nights when fever rose and shadows shifted. Despite this, many recovered. Bodies adapted, endured, healed slowly. Rest, warmth, and time did their work. Strength returned gradually, first as appetite, then as movement, then as confidence. The first day back outside after illness felt fragile but hopeful. The cold air bit harder, but it also reminded them they were still part of the living world. Those who survived illness often emerged changed. They moved more cautiously. They listened to their bodies with greater attention. They prepared more thoroughly the following seasons, storing extra food, extra wood, extra supplies when possible. Illness taught lessons that no amount of planning could fully replace. Winter did not pause for sickness. Snow still fell. Fires still demanded fuel. Hunger still waited. Survival meant meeting these demands even while weakened. It was a quiet form of resilience, practiced without audience or reward. In the Rocky Mountain cabins of the 1800s, illness and injury were not dramatic battles fought with doctors and cures. They were private struggles, carried out beside the fire, measured in patience and endurance. With no help coming, settlers relied on themselves, their preparation, and the slow, stubborn will to remain alive until spring returned. Hope in the mountains was not a loud or reckless thing. It was not allowed to run ahead of reality or promise what the winter might not deliver. Instead, hope was treated with the same care as food and firewood. It was rationed, measured out in small, steady portions meant to last until spring. Settlers learned early that expecting too much from any single day could be dangerous. A stretch of clear weather did not mean winter was weakening. A full woodpile did not mean it would be enough. Hope that flared too brightly could lead to careless decisions, and carelessness was punished quickly in the cold. So hope was kept quiet, folded neatly into routine. Rationing hope began with the calendar even when there was no calendar to look at. Days were counted loosely, marked by changes in light and cold rather than numbers. The focus stayed narrow, not the end of winter but the end of the day, not the return of spring but the next sunrise. Each small goal reached became its own reward. Food taught this discipline well. Supplies were divided carefully, portions chosen to satisfy without exhausting stores. The same approach applied to expectations. Settlers did not dream of abundance while chewing dried meat. They allowed themselves satisfaction in having enough for today. Tomorrow would be considered when it arrived. The fire also shaped hope. A strong blaze was comforting, but it was never indulged without thought. Burning too much wood early meant colder nights later. In the same way, emotional highs were tempered. Joy was allowed, but it was restrained, grounded. Celebrating survival too loudly in midwinter felt premature, almost tempting fate. Conversations, when they happened, reflected this mindset. Plans for spring were spoken of cautiously. Someone might mention planting or travel, but only briefly. Dwelling too long on the future made the present harder to endure. It created a contrast between what was and what might be, and that gap could feel overwhelming. Hope was invested instead in systems and habits. Trust was placed in routines that had worked before. Wake, tend the fire, eat, work, rest, repeat. There was comfort in predictability. Each completed cycle reinforced the belief that the next one could also be managed. The mind needed structure as much as the body did. Without it, thoughts drifted toward extremes, either despair or false optimism. Both were dangerous. Rationed hope stayed balanced. It acknowledged hardship without surrendering to it. It accepted uncertainty without inventing guarantees. Settlers often found hope in preparation itself, sharpening a tool, mending clothing, organizing supplies. These acts suggested continuity. They implied a future, even if it was not clearly imagined. Doing something useful for tomorrow, no matter how small, kept hope grounded in action rather than fantasy. Weather tested this discipline constantly. A sudden thaw could lift spirits, making the air feel almost gentle. Snow softened, and the world seemed less hostile. But experienced settlers resisted the urge to relax too much. Thaws often ended abruptly, followed by deeper cold. Hope learned to wait and watch rather than celebrate. Illness and exhaustion strained hope further. On days when strength was low, optimism could feel like an added burden. In those moments, hope shrank to its smallest form, not getting worse, making it through the night, keeping the fire alive. That was enough. Night was when hope needed the most control. Darkness encouraged imagination, and imagination could spiral. Thoughts of endless winter or forgotten rescue crept in easily. Settlers countered this by narrowing their focus again, listening to the fire, feeling warmth on their hands, trusting the cabin. Hope became sensory, immediate. Children learned this discipline by watching adults. They saw excitement contained, disappointment accepted quietly. They learned that survival did not require constant reassurance, only steady effort. Hope, they discovered, did not have to feel good all the time to be useful. Spring, when it finally came, often arrived gradually, almost unnoticed at first. Snow softened, light lingered longer, birds earned hesitantly. For those who had rationed hope well, these changes felt like confirmations rather than surprises. Their expectations had not outrun reality. Those who survived harsh winters carried this lesson with them long after. In later years, they spoke less about luck and more about patience. They understood that hope, like food and fire, could be wasted if used carelessly. In the Rocky Mountain cabins of the 1800s, hope was not a dramatic force that carried settlers through winter in a single surge. It was a quiet discipline, practiced daily. Measured, restrained, and steady, it lasted because it was never allowed to burn too fast. The mountains did not explain themselves. They offered no warnings in words, no clear lessons delivered all at once. Their rules were learned slowly through observation, repetition, and consequence. Settlers who survived long winters came to understand that the land was not cruel, but it was exacting. It responded precisely to every choice made within it. At first, many arrived believing strength alone would carry them through. Strong backs, sharp tools, confidence built elsewhere. The mountains stripped those assumptions away quickly. Strength mattered, but only when paired with timing and restraint. Swinging an axe without reading the weather could waste energy. Traveling without understanding terrain could end a life. One of the first rules learned was respect for scale. Distances that looked manageable in summer became vast in winter. A mile through snow was not the same mile walked in warm weather. The mountains taught settlers to think smaller, to shorten plans, to measure effort honestly rather than optimistically. Weather became a language to study. Clouds gathered differently here, moving along ridges in patterns that hinted at what was coming. Wind carried information in its direction and force. A sudden stillness often meant change. Those who paid attention adjusted early, closing shutters, reinforcing roofs, staying close to shelter. Another rule was the value of patience. The mountains punished haste. Rushing to finish a task before dark often led to mistakes. Waiting for better light or calmer wind saved lives. Settlers learned to pause, even when urgency pressed. Time spent waiting was not wasted if it prevented disaster. Sound behaved differently in the high country. Snow absorbed noise, creating silence that hid danger. A falling branch, a shifting slope, the crack of ice could go unheard. This taught vigilance. Settlers moved carefully, scanning visually rather than relying on sound alone. The land also enforced limits on pride. Those who refused to adapt often did not last. Cabins built too large were impossible to heat. Travel routes chosen for convenience rather than safety became traps. The mountains demanded humility, rewarding those who accepted guidance over ego. Fire followed its own rules here. Wood burned differently in thin air. Some trees sparked violently, others smouldered. Ki behaved unpredictably, sometimes refusing to rise. Settlers learned which fuel to use, how to shape chimneys, how to keep fire controlled without suffocating it. Water, usually abundant, became precious when frozen. Springs vanished beneath ice, streams slowed or disappeared. Settlers memorized their locations in warmer months and protected access points carefully. Losing water in winter was as dangerous as losing heat. Movement through snow taught another set of rules. Breaking trail exhausted the body quickly. Drifts hid obstacles. Slopes that were harmless in summer became treacherous. Settlers learned to test ground before committing weight, to read snow texture, to turn back when conditions shifted. Animals were both teachers and warnings. Their behavior signaled weather changes. Their paths revealed safer routes. Their disappearance indicated scarcity ahead. Watching wildlife was not curiosity, it was education. The mountains spoke through these patterns to those willing to look. Perhaps the hardest rule was acceptance. Not every goal could be achieved. Not every plan could be saved. The mountains decided some outcomes regardless of effort. Fighting this truth only drained strength. Accepting it allowed settlers to redirect energy toward what could still be controlled. Over time, these rules became instinct. Decisions were made without conscious thought, guided by accumulated experience. The mountains no longer felt unpredictable, but they were never fully tamed. Respect remained constant. Teaching newcomers was difficult. Rules learned through hardship were hard to explain. Words could not convey the weight of cold or the speed of change. Some lessons had to be lived. Those who listened carefully survived more often than those who insisted on learning alone. By spring, settlers who had endured winter carried a deeper understanding of place. They no longer saw the mountains as obstacles to conquer, but as systems to work within. Survival was not about domination but alignment. In the Rocky Mountain winters of the 1800s, learning the mountain's rules was a gradual process. Each mistake corrected, each observation noted, each adjustment made brought settlers closer to harmony with a land that demanded attention. Those who learned well were not fearless but informed, moving carefully within boundaries the mountains made clear. As winter deepened, light became something to be noticed rather than assumed. Days shortened quietly at first, then more sharply, until morning arrived late and evening returned early. The sun traced a low path across the sky, offering little warmth and less time. Settlers felt this change not just in their routines, but in their bodies. Waiting for the light to return was not a passive act. It required awareness and adjustment. Mornings began in darkness, guided by the fire's glow. Tasks were planned carefully, limited by the small window of daylight available. Every decision accounted for the sun's brief appearance, as if it were a scarce resource. Inside the cabin, dimness lingered even during the day. Windows admitted only muted light through oiled paper or frost. Shadows softened edges, making spaces feel smaller and more enclosed. Eyes strained to adapt, movements slowed to avoid accidents. Light, when it came, was treated with quiet gratitude. The absence of light affected the mind. Without long days, time felt compressed. Weeks blurred together. The body responded with heaviness, a desire for rest that had to be balanced against necessity. Settlers learned to listen to this pull without surrendering to it. Too much rest meant the fire went untended. Too little left the body worn thin. Waiting became a skill. There was waiting for dawn, for clear weather, for strength to return after illness, for storms to pass. Waiting was not idle. It was filled with small tasks done near the fire, mending clothing, sharpening tools, checking supplies. These activities kept hands moving even when the world outside offered nothing. Children felt the darkness keenly. Play shifted indoors, becoming quieter and more imaginative. Stories were told more often, not for entertainment alone, but to fill the space left by light. Words created warmth where sunlight could not reach. The land itself seemed to hold its breath during the darkest weeks. Animal tracks thinned, birds disappeared. Even the wind seemed restrained at times, as if conserving energy. This stillness could feel peaceful or oppressive, depending on the day. Settlers learned to accept both without assigning meaning beyond the moment. Night stretched longer than memory suggested it should. Sleep patterns shifted. Some woke in the middle of the night, unsure whether it was morning or still hours away. The fire served as the only constant marker. Its glow defined time when the sky could not. As the solstice passed, the change was almost imperceptible. No announcement marked the turning. A single evening lingered slightly longer. A morning brightened just a little sooner. Settlers noticed these changes slowly, often doubting their own observation at first. Hope grew cautiously from these small differences. Light was not celebrated loudly but acknowledged. A longer shadow, a brighter window, a sense that the balance was shifting, however subtly. The return of light was gradual, and so was the relief it brought. Work schedules adapted. Tasks once rushed into short afternoons could stretch a bit more. Outdoor work felt less urgent, less desperate. Bodies responded too, energy returning in small increments. Appetite sharpened, sleep grew more regular. Waiting for light also taught patience with change. Just as darkness had arrived slowly, so too did brightness. Settlers learned not to demand immediate transformation. They trusted the pattern, knowing it had held before and would hold again. Cabins seemed to open up as days lengthened. Shadows retreated. Corners became visible again. The world inside felt less compres. Said. This shift, though subtle, lifted spirits more effectively than any single warm day could. Even so, winter was not over when light returned. Cold persisted. Snow remained deep. But the direction had changed. Settlers felt it instinctively. The long arc toward spring had begun. In the Rocky Mountain winters of the 1800s, waiting for the light to return was an act of endurance shaped by attention. Each extra minute of daylight was earned through patience rather than struggle. The sun did not rush back, but when it did, it found settlers still there, steady beside their fires, ready to meet it. The first signs of thaw arrived quietly, almost uncertain of themselves. Winter did not release its grip all at once. Instead, it loosened gradually, testing whether it was truly time to step back. Settlers learned to notice these changes without trusting them completely. Snow changed texture before it changed shape. Where it had once been dry and sharp, it became heavier, clinging to boots and tools. Footsteps sounded different, less crisp, more muted. The surface softened under midday sun, only to harden again by night. This cycle marked the beginning of transition. Icicles told their own story. Once solid and unmoving, they began to drip slowly during the warmest hours. Each drop was small, but meaningful. Water returned to motion, even if briefly. The sound of dripping carried farther than expected, a gentle rhythm breaking the long winter silence. Inside the cabin, the fire Bahar ved differently. It was still needed, still watched carefully, but it no longer fought as fiercely against the cold. Warmth lingered longer after flames settled. Settlers noticed they could sit a little farther from the hearth without discomfort. Daylight played a larger role now. Sunlight reached deeper into the cabin, touching surfaces that had remained in shadow for months. Dust motes became visible again, floating lazily in the air. Windows cleared for longer stretches, revealing hints of the world beyond. The land responded slowly. Streams whispered beneath ice, their presence suggested by darker lines or faint movement. Snow pulled away from tree trunks, revealing rings of earth that breathed again. These signs were subtle, easily missed by anyone not watching closely. Animals began to reappear cautiously. Tracks showed up where none had been seen for weeks. Birds returned in ones and twos, their calls tentative, as if checking whether it was safe to stay. Settlers took note but remained measured. False springs were common, and trust had to be earned. Work shifted slightly. Heavy winter tasks gave way to preparation for what came next. Tools were inspected with renewed attention. Containers were cleaned. Seed stock, if there was any, was checked carefully. These actions were not declarations of victory, but acknowledgments of possibility. The smell of the air changed. Cold still dominated, but beneath it was a hint of moisture, of soil waking under snow. Breathing felt different, less sharp. Lungs welcomed this change quietly, without celebration. Clothing layers were adjusted cautiously. A coat opened briefly during midday work, then closed again as soon as shade returned. Settlers respected the cold's ability to return quickly. Exposure still carried risk, and winter had not yet surrendered. The ground remained treacherous. Thawing and freezing created slick surfaces and hidden weak spots. Steps were taken carefully. Injury at this stage would be especially cruel. Arriving just as relief seemed near, patience remained essential. Emotions shifted alongside the land. Tension eased slightly, though vigilance stayed in place. There was a sense of forward movement, of having passed something difficult. But no one spoke of survival yet. That word belonged to spring, not the threshold before it. Nights changed too. Cold still returned after sunset, but it felt different, less absolute. The darkness seemed lighter, shorter. Fires burned a little less fiercely, consuming wood more slowly. Embers lasted longer into morning. Settlers marked these changes internally. There were no calendars to flip, no dates to circle. Awareness lived in the body and in habit. Each sign was noted, then set aside, allowed to accumulate quietly. The thaw taught restraint as much as hope. It reminded settlers that endings rarely arrived cleanly. Transition demanded as much attention as hardship. Mistakes made in thaw could undo months of careful endurance. In the Rocky mountain winters of the 1800s, the first signs of thaw were not celebrated with certainty. They were observed with respect. Each drip, each softened step, each longer hour of light whispered the same message. Winter was loosening its hold, and those who had waited patiently were still there to witness it. When spring finally settled into the mountains, the silence it revealed was not always peaceful. Cabins stood where voices had once been. Fireplaces lay cold, their ashes untouched since winter's height. The land did not announce who had endured and who had not. It simply remained, unchanged by human outcome. So few survived to tell the story because survival demanded constancy, not moments of heroism. The mountains did not reward bravery in bursts. They favored steadiness, preparation, and restraint practiced every day without recognition. Those who faltered once, even briefly, often paid for it over weeks that followed. Winter exposed every weakness slowly, a misjudged ration, a cracked wall left unrepaired, a woodpile cut just a little too small. None of these mistakes were fatal on their own. Together, layered over months, they became impossible to overcome. The mountains did not need dramatic failure, they only needed time. Many settlers arrived with skills that served them well elsewhere but failed here. Knowledge that worked in milder climates could not be adapted quickly enough. The margin for error in the Rockies was thin, and winter narrowed it further. Learning had to happen early, often before lessons could be tested safely. Isolation played its part. With no one to correct mistakes or share burdens, errors went unnoticed until they grew serious. Illness progressed without witness. Exhaustion deepened without relief. Even strong-willed individuals struggled when there was no one to observe, encourage, or intervene. The cold itself was relentless. It did not negotiate or rest. It wore down strength quietly, day by day, night by night. Bodies consumed more energy just to remain warm, leaving less for healing, thinking, and adaptation. Hunger dulled judgment. Fatigue slowed response. Winter turned small disadvantages into lasting damage. Mental endurance proved as critical as physical strength. Long darkness, silence, and repetition tested resolve. Some lost focus, others lost hope. A single careless decision made during despair could undo months of careful survival. The mountains were unforgiving of moments when attention drifted. Preparation determined outcomes long before winter arrived. Those who cut extra wood, stored more food, reinforced cabins thoroughly, and respected seasonal timing carried invisible advantages. Those who arrived late or underestimated conditions entered winter already behind, struggling to catch up as days shortened. Luck existed, but it favored the prepared. A mild stretch of weather helped those with strong foundations far more than those without. Chance alone could not sustain life through months of colder, ND isolation. It could only amplify choices already made. The land itself remained indifferent. It did not adapt to settlers. Rivers froze when they froze. Storms came when they came. The mountains offered no exceptions. Survival required alignment with these rhythms, not resistance to them. Those who lived through winter emerged altered. They spoke less dramatically about their experience than expected. There were no grand victories to recount, only countless small decisions that accumulated into endurance. They understood that telling the story meant acknowledging how easily it could have ended differently. Many stories were never told because no one remained to tell them. Cabins were found in spring with supplies still present, fires long extinguished. These were not failures of effort, but of accumulation. The mountains had simply outlasted them. Survivors often carried a quiet respect for those who did not make it. There was no judgment, only understanding. They knew how narrow the margin had been. They knew how close they themselves had come to joining the silence. In the Rocky Mountain winters of the 1800s, survival was rare not because people were weak, but because the conditions were exacting beyond ordinary measure. Those who survived did so through discipline, patience, and attention, carried across every hour of the season. That is why so few lived to tell the story, and why those stories, when spoken softly beside later fires, carried weight far greater than their words.